On the cold, bright morning of 6th of November, 1895, in the gold and cream drawing room of Marble House, Newport, Consuelo Vanderbilt sits very still while a maid fastens the tiny pearl buttons on her white kid gloves. Outside, special trains are delivering crowds to St. Thomas's Church in New York, where newspapers have already christened the event the Wedding of the Century. On a nearby console table lies that morning's New York Times, describing the floral arches, the Duchess-to-be, the thousands expected to besiege Fifth Avenue. In her lap, Consuelo's fingers keep returning to the seam of her right glove, smoothing it, then smoothing it again. A small, controlled movement betraying the storm beneath the satin surface. Years later, in her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, she will write of pleading for the right to marry for love and being locked in her room until she consented. Now, as her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, enters in a rustle of silk and diamonds, the gloves are finally perfect. No one in the room speaks of the price that has just been paid. On 2nd March 1877, in a brownstone mansion on West 52nd Street in Manhattan, Consuelo Vanderbilt was born to William Kissam Vanderbilt and his formidable wife Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt. Birth notices in New York society pages place her squarely within the nation's most visible fortune, the Vanderbilt Railroad empire that has made her grandfather Cornelius Vanderbilt II one of America's wealthiest men. Her given name is itself an instruction, a blueprint for her future, written before she can walk. She is named after her godmother, Consuelo Iznaga, an American-born Cuban heiress who in 1876 had married Viscount Mandeville, later becoming the Duchess of Manchester, one of the earliest and most celebrated unions of American money and British aristocracy. The choice is deliberate, unmistakable. From the moment Alva selects this name, her friends and family understand what it signals. This daughter is meant not merely to adorn New York drawing rooms, but to move, eventually, through European palaces, to trade her fortune for a title that will elevate the Vanderbilt name beyond mere wealth into something approaching nobility. The infant's layette is imported from Paris, the finest French lace and embroidery money can buy. In the nursery, conversation is conducted partly in French, even when Consuelo is too young to understand, preparing her ear for the language she will need to master. Alva, daughter of a Southern cotton broker, whose family lost everything in the Civil War, has clawed her way into New York society through determination, strategic marriage, and an iron will. She views her daughter not with the tender indulgence of a doting mother, but with the calculating eye of an architect examining raw materials for a grand project. In family papers preserved at various archives and in later biographies by historians studying the Gilded Age, Alva emerges as a woman of remarkable intelligence and ambition, but also as someone who sees her child almost as she might view one of the mansions she will later commission, something to be shaped, improved, perfected, and ultimately displayed as proof of her own taste and power. The infant Consuelo, swaddled in French lace, has already been assigned her role in a drama she has no power to refuse. The Vanderbilt fortune that surrounds Consuelo's cradle is staggering even by Gilded Age standards. Her grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built an empire on steamships and railroads, dying in 1877, the year of Consuelo's birth, leaving a fortune estimated at $100 million, the largest in America. Her father, William Kissam, known as Willie K., inherited a substantial portion of this wealth and the responsibility of maintaining the family's position in New York society, a task made more complicated by the old Knickerbocker families who view the Vanderbilts as nouveau riche, their money too recently earned to be truly respectable. Alva understands this social calculus with painful clarity. She knows that no amount of Vanderbilt millions can force open the doors of the most exclusive New York drawing rooms, dominated by Mrs. Carolyn Astor and her circle of old money families. But she also understands that European aristocracy, cash poor and status rich, might offer a different path to social legitimacy. If her daughter can become a duchess, not through birth but through marriage, then the Vanderbilt name will be sanctified in a way that no New York ballroom can accomplish. The narrator observes that before Consuelo can speak her own name, her life has been drafted as a blueprint for social ascent. The same godmother who gave her a name also provided the model, an American heiress traded for a title, dollars exchanged for the ancient prestige of the British peerage. Consuelo's nursery, with its imported French furniture and her governesses speaking in carefully accented English and French, is already a training ground for a future that has been determined without her consent or even her knowledge. By the mid-1880s, the Vanderbilt family had consolidated its position among New York's wealthiest, though not yet among its most socially accepted. In 1883, William Kissam Vanderbilt commissions architect Richard Morris Hunt to design a French Renaissance chateau on Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets, a limestone mansion that newspapers dubbed the Petit Chateau. 665th Avenue, a palace in the heart of Manhattan designed explicitly to challenge the brownstone respectability of older New York families. The house, completed at enormous expense, becomes the stage for Alva's greatest social triumph. On 26 March 1883, she hosted a costume ball that forced even Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her. The story, preserved in contemporary accounts and retold in countless histories, has become legendary. Mrs. Astor's daughter wishes to attend, but Alva points out that she cannot invite anyone with whom she is not acquainted, as she has never been formally called upon by Mrs. Astor. The grande dame capitulates, makes her call, and Alva's ball proceeds with over 1,000 guests in elaborate costumes, establishing the Vanderbilts as social forces to be reckoned with. Young Consuelo grows up in this world of calculated grandeur and strategic entertainment. Inside the limestone walls of the Petit Chateau, childhood feels less like play than like an intensive training program. In The Glitter and the Gold, her memoir published decades later, Consuelo recalls that by age 8 she could read and write fluently in French, German, and English, drilled daily by 2 governesses, one French, one German, under her mother's close and demanding supervision. The regime is exacting. Lessons begin early each morning and continue through the afternoon. Languages, history, literature, music, drawing. But beyond academic subjects, Consuelo also receives training in deportment that borders on the obsessive. She later describes what she calls a horrible instrument, a steel rod or brace running from the back of her head down her spine to her waist, strapped to her back during lessons to enforce absolutely perfect posture. The device is painful and humiliating, making it difficult to bend or relax, forcing her to sit and stand with the rigid uprightness that Alva considers essential for a future duchess. When visitors are announced, the governesses quickly remove the posture brace, smooth Consuelo's dress, and press soft leather gloves into her small hands. She has been trained to enter drawing rooms with a specific gait, to curtsy at precisely the correct depth for various ranks of visitor, to adjust her gloves so they reveal exactly the proper length of wrist. Not too much, not too little. In the mirrors of the Petit Chateau's gilded salons, where French and Italian paintings hang in heavy gold frames and chandeliers cast prismatic light, a small dark-haired girl practices these rituals again and again until they become automatic. Summers are spent in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Vanderbilts and other wealthy New York families maintain elaborate cottages, mansions designed for the summer season of entertaining, sailing, and establishing the social hierarchies that will govern the winter season in the city. Newport is where marriages are made, where daughters are displayed, where mothers compete to secure the best matches for their children and to claim the highest social positions for themselves. The narrator reflects that the same discipline that straightens Consuelo's spine also trains her to hide discomfort behind a mask of elegance. She is learning that pain must never be visible, that perfect posture matters more than physical comfort, that appearance always trumps authentic feeling. The steel rod that digs into her back is preparing her not just for good posture, but for a life in which her own desires and discomforts will always be secondary to the image she presents to the world. As Newport evolves into the undisputed summer capital of American high society, and as Alva's social ambitions grow ever more grand, she begins designing a future in which her daughter's perfect posture and the Vanderbilt millions attached to that carefully trained body will be on public display in the most spectacular way imaginable. A marriage that will unite American wealth with British aristocracy, dollars with a dukedom, the Vanderbilt name with one of England's most ancient titles. By the summer of 1892, Marble House on Bellevue Avenue in Newport stood complete, Alva Vanderbilt's ultimate statement of wealth and taste, and perhaps more importantly, her ultimate weapon in the ongoing social wars of the Gilded Age. William Kissam Vanderbilt has given the house to Alva as a gift for her 39th birthday, though gift barely captures the scale. Richard Morris Hunt's Beaux-Arts masterpiece costs approximately $11 million to build and furnish, with the majority spent on imported marble from which the house takes its name. The statistics, documented in contemporary accounts and architectural histories, are staggering. 50 rooms spread across 4 floors, 500,000 cubic feet of American and foreign marble, gold-encrusted rooms designed to evoke Versailles and the great palaces of Europe. The Gothic room features medieval stained glass and carved wood brought from French chateaux. The Gold Ballroom, perhaps the most spectacular space, has walls and ceiling covered in gold leaf, with massive Baccarat crystal chandeliers and Louis XIV furnishings. Marble House is not merely a summer house, but a declaration. The Vanderbilts are now, indisputably, American royalty. Within these magnificent rooms, Consuelo's education intensifies. She's now a teenager, and Alva's focus has sharpened from general cultivation to specific preparation for the marriage market. The curriculum includes history and literature, Latin and additional European languages, riding and carriage driving, piano, and other appropriate accomplishments. But increasingly, the emphasis is on deportment, presentation, the subtle arts of conversation and social navigation that will be required of a woman moving in the highest circles. Society columnists have begun to notice. By 1893 and 1894, Consuelo appeared regularly in coverage of Newport cotillions and New York society events. Her figure is described in the newspapers as regal, her carriage faultless, adjectives that directly reflect the years of painful training with the posture brace, the endless hours of practice walking with books balanced on her head, the constant corrections and adjustments. At 16, 17 years old, Consuelo Vanderbilt has become exactly what her mother intended, a perfectly polished young woman ready to be offered on the aristocratic marriage market. But in early 1895, the carefully constructed Vanderbilt facade cracked. In March, after years of Willie K. is known, infidelities and Alva's growing frustration with his lack of social ambition to match her own, Alva files for divorce, a scandalous act that sends shockwaves through New York society. Divorce in the 1890s remains deeply stigmatizing, particularly among the upper classes. But Alva, characteristically, refuses to be cowed by convention. The divorce settlement awards her custody of Consuelo and the other children, ownership of Marble House, and a substantial financial settlement. The divorce also makes Alva's plans for Consuelo more urgent. A divorced woman's social position, however wealthy, is always precarious. But a divorced woman whose daughter becomes a duchess, that is a different story entirely. Alva understands that Consuelo's marriage to European nobility will not only secure her daughter's future, but also restore and even enhance Alva's own position, proving that her taste and training have produced something even more valuable than social acceptance, a daughter worthy of ancient bloodlines. Around this same time, a new figure enters the correspondence and the careful negotiations that will determine Consuelo's future. Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, known as Sonny from one of his subsidiary titles, the Earl of Sunderland. He is in his early 20s, heir to Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, one of England's greatest houses, but also one requiring enormous sums to maintain, sums that the Marlborough estate can no longer provide. The Churchill fortune has been dissipated through generations, and the current Duke needs an infusion of American capital to save his ancestral home. Sources, including contemporary correspondence and later historical accounts, agree that Alva sees in the Duke of Marlborough the perfect match, a title to sanctify her own social ascent, a palace in need of Vanderbilt millions, a young man desperate enough to overlook the stigma of Alva's divorce, and eager enough for American money to accept terms that will be extraordinarily favorable to the bride's family. What Alva does not account for, or perhaps simply dismisses as irrelevant, is that Consuelo has quietly fallen in love. The young man's name is Winthrop Rutherford, known as Winty. He comes from a good family, socially acceptable, well connected, but he lacks the title Alva craves and the international prestige she has been planning for since the day she named her daughter after a future duchess. The narrator observes that, in a world organized around strategic alliances, a young woman's authentic feelings register mainly as an obstacle to be overcome or ignored. Love, in this calculation, is not an asset but a liability, something that threatens the careful architecture of dynastic planning. When Consuelo dares to assert, as she later recalls, "I considered I had a right to choose my own husband," calling those the bravest words I have ever uttered, the response will be swift and devastating. Architectural indeed, in the form of a locked door. By 1893 and 1894, as Alva's social campaigns reached their zenith and the divorce from Willie Kay became final, Consuelo's instruction narrowed toward a single, specific goal: preparation for presentation as an ideal bride for a great European house. Every aspect of her training is calibrated to this purpose. The lessons in French and German conversation intensify, moving from basic fluency to the kind of sophisticated literary competence that will allow her to hold her own in European salons. Advanced piano study continues, not for professional accomplishment, but because musical ability is expected of accomplished women. The study of European court history and protocol becomes central. She must understand lineages, precedents, the complex etiquette of different national aristocracies. Riding and carriage driving practice, which might seem like mere recreation, are actually crucial preparation for English country house life, where hunting and outdoor sports form the backbone of social interaction. Consuelo must be able to ride well enough to keep up during hunts, to drive a carriage with competence and style, to navigate the outdoor rituals that define British aristocratic leisure. But above all, deportment, the physical presentation of self, becomes almost a science. In her autobiography, written decades later with the perspective of age and distance, Consuelo remembers the endless hours spent walking with books balanced precariously on her head, her chin lifted at exactly the right angle to elongate the neck and suggest noble bearing. Her hands remain sheathed in light-colored gloves even during practice sessions, fostering the impression of refinement so habitual that it appears effortless rather than the result of grinding discipline. The training extends to subtle matters of gesture and expression. She learns to modulate her voice to the low musical tones considered elegant rather than shrill. She practices entering rooms with a specific gait, not too fast, not too slow, with a certain quality of gliding progress that suggests grace rather than merely walking. She learns to smile with her eyes rather than broadly with her mouth, a technique that photographs better and appears more refined. Even her laughter is coached, quiet amusement rather than hearty guffaws, always controlled, never crude. Alva's role in this training is hands-on and uncompromising. She reviews every lesson, corrects every flaw, tolerates no deviation from her exacting standards. In later accounts, Consuelo recalls her mother's guiding principle, a phrase that encapsulates their entire relationship: "I do the thinking. You do as you are told." The dynamic is clear, absolute. Alva is the architect. Consuelo is the material being shaped. Questions are not welcomed, objections are not tolerated, and personal preferences are utterly irrelevant. Each correction of posture, of tone, of how far down to pull a glove to achieve the perfect proportion of covered forearm to visible wrist is a reminder of who holds power in this relationship and who is merely subject to that power. The gloves themselves become symbols of this constraint: beautiful, expensive, perfectly fitted, but also binding, restricting free movement, creating a barrier between Consuelo's skin and the world she touches. The narrator reflects that finishing school here is not an institution but a relationship, one in which obedience is not merely expected, but is the primary art being taught. Consuelo is learning to be ornamental, compliant, perfect in execution of other people's designs for her life. She is learning, most fundamentally, that her own will does not matter, that asserting it will bring only conflict and pain, that survival requires submission. Yet submission, as she will discover, has its limits. For all of Alva's careful training, for all the years of discipline and correction and ruthless shaping of her daughter into the perfect vessel for aristocratic marriage, there is one element Alva cannot fully control: Consuelo's capacity for independent feeling, for love that follows its own logic rather than strategic planning. In the early months of 1895, during the winter social season in New York and the preparations for the summer season in Newport, Consuelo's private life develops in ways that directly contradict her mother's plans. She has met Winthrop Rutherford, handsome, athletic, from an old New York family of unquestionable social standing, and between them has grown what contemporary sources describe, and Consuelo later confirms as a genuine attachment, perhaps love. The relationship develops during the prescribed social rituals of their class: chaperoned walks in Central Park, carriage rides along acceptable routes, carefully supervised meetings at social events where young people of appropriate backgrounds mix under the watchful eyes of mothers and chaperones. But within these constrained spaces, Consuelo and Winty establish an understanding. They talk, they share thoughts and feelings, and Consuelo allows herself to imagine a future different from the one her mother has been architecting for years. A future as Mrs. Winthrop Rutherford rather than the Duchess of Marlborough. To Consuelo, the difference is everything. Rutherford represents life in America, among her own people, in her own country. He offers companionship with someone she has chosen, rather than someone chosen for her. The marriage would be socially acceptable. His family's credentials are impeccable, while allowing her to avoid the exile and isolation she suspects would come with marrying into the British aristocracy. To Alva, the difference is equally clear, but leads to opposite conclusions. Rutherford, however well-born, lacks a title. He cannot offer what Alva has been planning for: the transformation of her daughter into European nobility, the validation of decades of social climbing, the ultimate proof that American ambition and American money can purchase even what centuries of European aristocracy have reserved for themselves. Marriage to Rutherford would be a waste, a squandering of the asset Alva has been so carefully cultivating. As spring turned toward summer in 1895, conversations at Marble House became increasingly tense. Consuelo tries to assert her preference, to explain her feelings, to argue that she should have some voice in determining her own future. Alva responds with a torrent of counter-arguments: duty to family, the social benefits of a great match, the opportunities that will be foreclosed if Consuelo makes this small-minded, parochial choice. The discussions are not really negotiations. Alva has no intention of being swayed by her daughter's preferences. She has already been corresponding with the Duke of Marlborough, has already begun the delicate work of arranging a match, has already envisioned the headlines and the social triumph that will come when her daughter becomes a duchess. Consuelo's resistance is, in Alva's view, merely an obstacle to be overcome, a temporary bout of sentiment that will pass once Consuelo understands she has no real choice. In The Glitter and the Gold, Consuelo recalls telling her mother directly, "I considered I had a right to choose my own husband." She describes these as the bravest words I have ever uttered, a phrase that reveals both her awareness of her own powerlessness and her brief, desperate attempt to claim agency over her own life. The words hang in the air of Marble House's gold-leafed rooms, brave and futile, like a protest shouted into the wind. As Consuelo speaks, as she makes this plea for autonomy, her fingers drift unconsciously to the wrist of her glove, tugging the soft leather down, as if to protect bare skin from something dangerous, something cold. The gesture is small, barely noticeable, but it betrays her awareness of her own vulnerability, her sense that she is about to be hurt in ways she cannot fully imagine or prevent. The narrator observes that in a home built of imported marble, where walls are solid and doors are heavy, the softer boundary between self and duty, between desire and obligation, proves far easier to violate. Stone can protect from weather and intrusion, but no architecture can defend a girl against her own mother's will when that will is backed by absolute control of resources and social power. In the late summer and early autumn of 1895, in her bedroom at Marble House, a room that should represent privacy and safety, but that has become instead a kind of genteel prison, Consuelo's resistance reaches its peak and then crumbles. The sequence of events, though painful, is well documented through her own later memoir and contemporary sources that confirm the broad outlines even if some details remain disputed. According to Consuelo's account, she attempts at one point to elope with Winthrop Rutherford, to escape Marble House and her mother's control through direct action. The attempt fails, whether through discovery, through failure of nerve, or through Rutherford's own hesitation is not entirely clear from surviving records. What is clear is that after this failed escape, Alva's response is swift and total. Consuelo is confined to her room and forbidden to see anyone but her mother and a carefully selected priest who will reinforce the message of duty and obedience. The confinement is not physically brutal. There are no chains, no overt violence, but it is psychologically devastating. Consuelo is isolated, cut off from any source of support or alternative perspective, subjected to a sustained campaign of pressure from the two adults who have been granted access to her prison. Alva visits repeatedly, her arguments a mixture of appeals and threats. Appeals to family duty, to social responsibility, to the opportunities being offered, threats of social ruin, of financial consequences, of the destruction of carefully laid plans if Consuelo continues her stubborn resistance. But Alva's most effective weapon, deployed with calculated precision, is emotional manipulation through claimed fragility. She tells Consuelo that the stress of this conflict is making her ill, that she cannot bear the strain of her daughter's refusal, that Consuelo's stubbornness might literally kill her. For a daughter raised to feel responsible for her mother's social triumphs and failures, raised to understand that disappointing Alva is a kind of betrayal, this argument is devastating. Consuelo, only 18 years old, finds herself trapped between her own desires and the weight of guilt for potentially harming her mother. Alone in her room, a beautiful room with silk wallpaper and fine furniture, a comfortable prison, Consuelo sits on the edge of her bed, her formal evening gloves lying unused beside her. Hour after hour, day after day, she picks up the gloves, smooths the fingers, adjusts the soft leather, lays them down again. The gesture is compulsive, a kind of rehearsal for a role she desperately does not want to play but cannot see how to avoid. The gloves, white kid leather with tiny pearl buttons, have been custom made for her trousseau, prepared in anticipation of her engagement and wedding. They are perfect, expensive, beautiful objects, and they represent everything she is trying to resist. But as the days of confinement stretch on, as the pressure builds and her isolation becomes unbearable, as guilt and exhaustion wear down her will, the gloves become less a symbol of resistance and more a symbol of inevitability. Eventually, she yields. The exact moment, the precise words spoken, are not recorded in any document. This is a private surrender, witnessed only by mother and daughter, but the outcome is documented. Consuelo agrees to marry the Duke of Marlborough, to abandon her hope of marrying Rutherford, to accept the future Alva has planned for her. In her own words written decades later with the bitterness of hindsight, she describes being whisked away to England, to a life at Blenheim Palace, to a marriage she never wanted, to a role she never chose. The language is telling. Whisked away suggests passivity, suggests being moved by forces outside her control, suggests that even in the telling of her own story, she struggles to claim an active voice for what happened to her. The narrator observes that the door to Consuelo's room opens only after her will has been reshaped to match the architecture around her. Only after the psychological pressure has achieved what physical force might have accomplished more crudely but less completely. She emerges from her confinement consenting to the marriage, but it is a consent extracted through isolation, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion. Consent in form but coercion in substance. With this forced agreement secured, Alva can now proceed to the next phase, transforming private capitulation into public spectacle, staging the engagement and wedding as triumphs of romance rather than exercises in dynastic strategy and maternal domination. The machinery of publicity and celebration begins to turn, preparing for what newspapers will call the wedding of the century. By September 1895, with Consuelo's consent secured through confinement and psychological pressure, the engagement between Miss Consuelo Vanderbilt and Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, became official. Society columns in New York, London, and Paris immediately fill with details. Descriptions of the engagement ring, a substantial diamond, speculation about the dowry, widely reported as $2.5 million plus annual income of $100,000, and excited anticipation of the first American duchess to occupy Blenheim Palace since its construction in the early 18th century. Alva manages the publicity with the same tactical precision she has brought to every other aspect of the match. Selected journalists are invited to view the wedding gifts as they accumulate in the Petit Chateau's drawing rooms, an astonishing array of silver, crystal, jewels, and art objects sent by wealthy Americans eager to associate themselves with this grand alliance, and by British aristocrats welcoming the American money that will restore one of their greatest houses. The press coverage transforms the wedding from a private family event into a national spectacle, a moment when American wealth and ambition reach their highest expression through union with European nobility. Vogue magazine devotes extensive coverage to Consuelo's trousseau, describing in lavish detail the wedding gown of ivory satin and lace, the traveling costumes, the dozens of dresses and gowns being prepared for her new life as a duchess. The coverage functions as both reporting and advertising, positioning the Vanderbilt-Marlborough match as the ultimate expression of fashion and taste, a template for aspirational readers about what a truly great wedding should look like. Behind the magazine spreads and newspaper columns, Consuelo undergoes a final, intensified round of preparation. She must learn not just general European aristocratic etiquette, but the specific protocols of the English court and great houses. How to enter St. James's Palace for presentation to Queen Victoria. How to navigate the complicated precedence rules that will govern her every public appearance. How to address various ranks of nobility. How to manage the dozens of servants at Blenheim. How to sign her name as Marlborough rather than Vanderbilt. Each rehearsal of these rituals ends with the same gesture, slipping on newly fitted gloves, adjusting them carefully, flexing her fingers within the soft leather to ensure perfect fit and freedom of movement within constraint. The gloves are simultaneously practical. A lady of her rank would never appear in public with bare hands, and symbolic, a constant reminder that she is learning to live within boundaries set by others, that her touch on the world will always be mediated by the expectations and requirements of her position. The weeks between engagement and wedding are a blur of fittings, rehearsals, social obligations, and press attention. Consuelo moves through it all with the perfect deportment Alva has drilled into her. Gracious to visitors, appropriately modest about her upcoming elevation, careful never to display the ambivalence or despair she feels privately. The steel rod that once straightened her spine during lessons has been removed, but its discipline has been so thoroughly internalized that she no longer needs external enforcement to maintain perfect posture. She has become, externally at least, exactly what was intended, a flawless vessel for Vanderbilt wealth and Marlborough lineage. The narrator reflects that what looks from the outside like romance, what the newspapers and magazines present as a fairy tale of American beauty winning the heart of an English duke, is, in the actual paperwork and private negotiations, a meticulously constructed contract. The marriage settlement, negotiated by lawyers representing both families, specifies exactly how Vanderbilt money will flow to support Blenheim Palace, what pin money Consuelo will receive for her personal expenses, what happens to the fortune if the marriage fails, or if she predeceases her husband. Love, in these documents, is not mentioned. The marriage is being constructed as what it actually is, a business arrangement in which Consuelo's youth and fertility and willingness to play the role of duchess are being exchanged for a title and a position in the British aristocracy. On the 6th November 1895, the day of the wedding, the dissonance between the public performance and private reality was visible even to the crowds lining Fifth Avenue. But for now, in the weeks of preparation, the machinery moves forward smoothly, efficiently, transforming a coerced young woman into a willing bride, at least in appearance. On 6 November 1895, special trains brought thousands to Manhattan for what the New York Times has been calling the wedding of the century. Crowds begin gathering on Fifth Avenue before dawn, women particularly eager to catch a glimpse of the bride and the elaborate spectacle Alva has orchestrated. By mid-morning, traffic must be halted as the Vanderbilt carriages approach St. Thomas's Episcopal Church on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 53rd Street. Inside the church, the scene fulfills every extravagant expectation. The Times describes the floral decorations in exhaustive detail, arches of white roses and lilies creating a canopy over the aisle, massive arrangements at every column and pew end, palm fronds and trailing greenery creating a hothouse atmosphere despite the November cold outside. The guests, including New York Governor Levi P. Morton, the Astors, and virtually every family of consequence in New York society, fill the pews in rustling silk and glittering jewels. When Consuelo enters on her father's arm, Willie Kay has been allowed this role despite the divorce. She walks through this bower of white flowers wearing a gown that has been described and illustrated in newspapers for weeks. Ivory satin with a court train 5 yards long, trimmed with Brussels lace that reportedly belonged to Marie Antoinette, orange blossoms in her dark hair. Her face is covered by a tulle veil, but contemporary accounts and her own later memoir agree on one devastating detail. She is visibly weeping. The tears are not the sentimental tears of a happy bride, but the uncontrollable weeping of someone in profound distress. Witnesses describe her trembling, her difficulty maintaining composure as she walks up the aisle toward the Duke of Marlborough, waiting at the altar rail. The ceremony proceeds. Vows are exchanged, rings given. The bishop offers prayers, but the bride's distress cannot be hidden even by the veil and the distance of the pews from the altar. The following day, Life magazine publishes a cartoon that will become famous. It shows Consuelo chained to the altar while Alva holds the shackles, a brutal but widely understood commentary on what the public has witnessed. The image is extraordinarily harsh, accusing Alva of essentially selling her daughter for social advancement. But the fact that such a cartoon can be published in a major magazine, that its message resonates with enough readers to make it memorable, suggests that the public unease about this match is not limited to cynics or critics. Even in an age that accepts arranged marriages among the wealthy, even in a society that views daughters as assets to be strategically deployed, there is something about the Vanderbilt Marlborough wedding that strikes observers as having crossed a line from arrangement into coercion. In the few photographs taken that day, photography at weddings is still relatively new and is carefully controlled. Consuelo's gloved hand rests correctly on the Duke's sleeve. The gesture, technically perfect. Her posture is flawless, the result of years of training. But her eyes, even through the grain and blur of early photography, betray distress that her perfect deportment cannot fully conceal. After the ceremony, the wedding breakfast at the Vanderbilt mansion continues the display. Elaborate food, champagne, the cutting of a massive cake, speeches praising the union of American vitality and British nobility. Consuelo performs her role adequately, speaking when spoken to, accepting congratulations with appropriate grace, maintaining the composure that has been drilled into her for 18 years. But those close to her, including family members whose later accounts confirm her state of mind, describe her as moving through the reception like an automaton, present in body but absent in spirit. The narrator observes that society has come to witness a fairy tale, the ultimate validation of Gilded Age ambitions. An American heiress becoming a duchess, dollars triumphant over ancient bloodlines, the New World claiming its place among Old World nobility. What many recognized instead, whether they acknowledged it publicly or not, was a transaction conducted at human cost, a young woman's will broken and her future sold to serve her mother's ambitions and her father's willingness to facilitate those ambitions through the provision of an enormous dowry. Within days, the new Duke and Duchess of Marlborough will sail for England. Consuelo will be installed at Blenheim Palace, charged with the task of saving a house she has never seen, fulfilling duties she never chose, living a life that was designed for her but never by her. The architecture of privilege has achieved its purpose, but the woman trapped within that architecture has paid a price that no amount of marble or gilt or ancestral prestige can compensate for. By early 1896, Consuelo had taken up residence at Blenheim Palace in Woodstock, Oxfordshire, the great Baroque palace built in the early 18th century for John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, as a gift from a grateful nation after his military victories. The house, designed by John Vanbrugh and now over 150 years old, is magnificent and crumbling, grand and deeply uncomfortable, a monument to past glory desperately in need of the American money Consuelo has brought with her. Her dowry is already being deployed according to the careful plans made before the marriage. Central heating installed in at least part of the vast house, modern plumbing added to bathrooms, kitchens updated with equipment that makes it possible to serve hot food that has traveled less than a quarter mile from kitchen to dining room, furnishings restored, roofs repaired. The Vanderbilt millions are quite literally shoring up Blenheim, preventing its collapse into picturesque ruin. The Duke, according to multiple sources including Consuelo's own later account, is frank about the transaction. During their honeymoon, he reportedly tells her that he has married to save Blenheim, a statement she remembers decades later with cool clarity. The honesty is in some ways admirable. At least he is not pretending love he does not feel, but it is also devastating, a reminder that she is here as a financial instrument, not as a wife chosen for herself. Her days quickly settle into the routines of an English aristocratic estate. Rising late, breakfast served in her rooms, morning inspection of household arrangements, and consultations with the housekeeper about menus and schedules. Correspondence requiring her signature, afternoon calls or walks in the extensive grounds, tea in the drawing room, dinner with the Duke when he is in residence. Often he is not, pursuing political ambitions or other interests in London. Evenings spent reading or doing needlework in enormous rooms heated inadequately despite the new central heating system. The work is constant and often tedious. As Duchess of Marlborough, she must manage a household of dozens of servants, receive tenants who bring concerns about cottages and crops, attend church services in the estate chapel, participate in local charitable work, host shooting parties and other entertainments for the Duke's political and social connections. In The Glitter and the Gold, she describes the crushing weight of these expectations and the relief she finds in charitable work among villagers near the estate, work that allows her to feel useful and connected rather than merely ornamental. The portrait painted by Paul César Helot in 1900, now held in various collections and frequently reproduced, captures her in these years. Slim, elegant, somewhat remote, dressed in the height of fashion but with an expression that suggests interiority and reserve, rather than the vivacity her mother once tried to cultivate. It is the portrait of a woman fulfilling a role rather than living a life, performing duties rather than pursuing desires. At receptions and dinners, her long-gloved hands, always properly sheathed when in public, for a lady of her rank would never expose bare hands in formal settings, pour tea, sign guest books, accept the kisses and curtsies of those who must show deference to a duchess. The gestures are automatic now, perfected through repetition until they require no thought. She has become what she was trained to be, a woman who can perform the social rituals of her position flawlessly, who never reveals discomfort or disappointment, whose perfect deportment disguises whatever she actually thinks or feels. Letters home to her family, carefully preserved and later quoted in biographies, hint at loneliness and a sense of displacement. She misses America, misses the relative informality of even the most formal New York society compared to the rigid protocols of English aristocracy, misses having any choice about how she spends her time or with whom. But she cannot complain too openly. Such complaints would be admitting that her mother was wrong, that the great match was not worth its cost, and admitting this would serve no purpose except to prove her own earlier resistance was justified. The narrator reflects that the marriage has achieved its stated purposes. Blenheim is being saved through Vanderbilt money. The Marlborough lineage has been secured through an advantageous financial arrangement. Alva's social triumph is complete with her daughter, now a duchess. The marriage's capacity to sustain or fulfill the woman at its center is another matter entirely, one that was never really considered in the negotiations and planning that led to the match. By 1906, after a decade of this life, after producing 2 sons, the requisite heir and spare that aristocratic marriages require, after enduring years of mutual indifference occasionally sharpened into active dislike, Consuelo and the Duke will formally separate. But even in these early years, the essential emptiness of the arrangement is already clear to both parties. They have successfully concluded a business transaction. They have not created a marriage in any meaningful sense. In the spring of 1900, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the painter Paul César Helot visited Blenheim Palace to paint Consuelo's portrait. The Duke is away, serving as military officer during the Second Boer War in South Africa, using his position and connections to pursue the kind of active, meaningful work that aristocratic men can still claim even as their economic power fades. Consuelo remained at Blenheim, managing the estate and raising their 2 young sons. Helot's portrait, now held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and reproduced countless times, captures something essential about Consuelo in these years. She appears slim, elegant, dressed in the height of Edwardian fashion, her famous long neck emphasized by the composition, her dark eyes gazing out at the viewer with an expression that is neither welcoming nor hostile, but rather remote, self-possessed, observant. She looks like someone who is present in the scene but not entirely of it, someone performing the role of Duchess while maintaining an inner reserve that the performance cannot touch. The portrait becomes one of the defining images of its era, reproduced in society magazines and art publications, celebrated for its technical skill and its capture of a certain kind of aristocratic feminine ideal. Beauty that is controlled rather than exuberant, elegance that is about restraint rather than display. A figure who is decorative, but also somehow untouchable, preserved behind glass like a museum specimen. Over the years following the portrait, the emotional distance between Consuelo and the Duke widens from indifference to something approaching estrangement. He cultivates political ambitions, serving in various governmental positions, and pursuing his interests in London and beyond. She continues her charitable work, develops friendships and intellectual interests, discovers that she can create a life within the constraints of her position that provides some satisfaction, even if it bears no resemblance to the life she might have chosen for herself. By the middle of the decade, both Consuelo and the Duke had formed attachments elsewhere. He becomes deeply involved with Gladys Deakin, an American woman known for her beauty and intelligence, who becomes a fixture in his life long before the marriage to Consuelo ends. Consuelo, meanwhile, finds intellectual and emotional companionship with various friends, and eventually with Jacques Balsan, a French industrialist and aviation pioneer she meets in Paris social circles. These relationships are conducted with discretion. Divorce remains scandalous, and open adultery would damage their children's prospects and their own social positions. But they are also widely known within their social world. The aristocracy of this era operates on understood codes. Marriages are alliances that must be maintained for purposes of property and lineage, but emotional satisfaction is sought elsewhere, and this is accepted as long as basic proprieties are observed. In 1906, after years of living essentially separate lives, even when physically sharing the same houses, Consuelo and the Duke formalize their separation. She moves to Sunderland House in London, taking their sons for part of the year and continuing her role in society as Duchess of Marlborough, but without the pretense of an actual marriage. The separation is legal and official, but stops short of divorce, which remains difficult to obtain under English law of the period and would create complications around the title, and the children's status. Photographs from this period show a subtle shift in Consuelo's presentation. The gloves are still immaculate, always properly fitted and worn according to the strict rules of her class and position. But her expression has changed, less the carefully composed mask of the early years at Blenheim, more inward-looking, as if she has redirected her attention from the performance expected of her to her own internal landscape. She looks like someone who has discovered that she can survive by creating a private self separate from the public role, that she can maintain the Duchess's performance while keeping something essential protected and untouched by that performance. The narrator observes that the separation offers Consuelo physical freedom from a marriage that was never emotionally sustaining, but it does not offer full autonomy. She remains the Duchess of Marlborough, bound by the obligations that title entails, unable to remarry without creating scandal, her life still constrained by the social architecture erected around her in 1895. She has more room to move within that architecture, more ability to make choices about how she spends her time and with whom, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. Legal freedom, the complete undoing of the marriage that was forced upon her, will depend not only on changes in English civil law but also on the complex requirements of the Roman Catholic Church, to which both she and the Duke profess allegiance despite their obviously failed marriage. That freedom is still years away, and when it comes, it will be achieved through arguments about consent that echo back to that locked room at Marble House, to the tears at St. Thomas's Church, to the coercion that many recognized but few openly challenged. After years of formal separation, living independent lives while maintaining the legal fiction of marriage, Consuelo and the Duke obtained a civil divorce in 1921. English divorce law has been modernized somewhat by this point, making dissolution possible in cases where the marriage has clearly broken down irretrievably, and both parties want to be free to remarry. He to Gladys Deakin, she to Jacques Balsan. On 4th July 1921, shortly after the divorce became final, Consuelo married Jacques Balsan in a quiet ceremony that stands in stark contrast to the elaborate spectacle of her first wedding. Balsan is a French industrialist and pioneering aviator, someone who has achieved success through his own work rather than inherited title, someone whose relationship with Consuelo is based on genuine compatibility and affection rather than strategic family alliance. The marriage to Balsan represents, for Consuelo, a fundamental shift in how she inhabits her own life. For the first time since leaving Marble House as an 18-year-old bride, she is living with a man she has chosen, in a relationship built on mutual regard rather than imposed by others. The civil divorce has freed her legally, but there remains the question of religious sanction. Neither she nor the Duke can remarry within the Catholic Church while their first marriage remains valid in the eyes of Rome. The Vatican annulment of the Marlborough marriage, granted in 1926, is sought partly to regularize the Duke's marriage to Gladys Deakin, which took place in 1921 but remained problematic for Catholics, and partly to align Consuelo's union with Balsan with Catholic teachings. The annulment proceedings, conducted in Rome with testimony from various parties, center on the question of consent, specifically whether Consuelo's consent to the 1895 marriage was freely given or obtained through coercion. The language of the annulment, as reported in contemporary accounts and later analyzed by historians, explicitly acknowledges what Consuelo had described in private and would later describe publicly, that she did not enter the marriage freely, that her consent was obtained through pressure and confinement, that she was essentially forced into a match she had tried to resist. The Church's finding, in this sense, officially validates what many observers recognized at the time, but could not openly challenge without attacking one of the most prominent social figures of the era. In a gesture both practical and symbolic, Consuelo has new personal items made bearing: the Balsan name and crest. The Marlborough arms, which for over 25 years appeared on her personal stationery, her household silver, her calling cards, began to recede into storage and eventually into museum collections. She is shedding not just a name but an entire identity that was imposed upon her, reclaiming the possibility of defining herself through choices rather than through obligations inherited from her mother's ambitions. The narrator reflects that the legal and ecclesiastical unwinding of what was called the perfect match acknowledges, decades after the fact, what Consuelo's tears at St. Thomas's Church had already declared. The coercion that forced an 18-year-old girl to marry against her will is finally, officially recognized as invalidating the marriage from its inception. The acknowledgement comes too late to give Consuelo back the years she spent as Duchess, too late to undo the damage of living a life chosen by others, but it at least provides official validation that her resistance was justified and her suffering was real. Settled with Jacques Balsan in France by the mid-1920s, dividing time between Paris and their country house at Saint-Georges Motel near Dreux, Consuelo experiences what she will later describe as the first genuinely happy period of her adult life. The marriage to Balsan is, by her own account, and that of those who know the couple, fundamentally different from her first marriage. Warmer, more companionate, based on mutual affection and shared interests rather than on dynastic requirements and financial transactions. The house at Saint-Georges Motel becomes a refuge, a place where Consuelo can garden, entertain friends on her own terms, pursue charitable work without the crushing weight of aristocratic obligation. She continues her philanthropic interests, now focused on rural poverty and agricultural improvement, using her wealth and connections to fund programs that provide real assistance rather than merely performing aristocratic noblesse oblige. During World War II, as German forces advanced through France, Consuelo and Jacques were actively involved in efforts to aid refugees and displaced persons, using their resources and international connections to help people escape Nazi-occupied territory. The work is dangerous and exhausting, carried out with the same determination Consuelo once brought to managing Blenheim, but now directed toward purposes she has chosen herself, rather than duties imposed by birth and marriage. Eventually, as the war situation deteriorates, they themselves return to the United States, settling in New York and spending time in Southampton on Long Island, not far from where Consuelo grew up in the Vanderbilt world. The return brings her full circle geographically, though the woman who comes back to America in her 60s is profoundly different from the girl who left for England in 1895. In 1953, living primarily in New York and Southampton, Consuelo published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. The book, written with assistance but clearly expressing her own voice and perspective, traces her journey from Vanderbilt heiress through reluctant Duchess to Balsan's wife, finally free to define herself on her own terms. The title itself captures the duality of her experience, the glittering surface of extreme wealth and social triumph, and the underlying gold, whether monetary or metaphorical, that made that glitter possible, and that was paid for. At her writing desk, preserved in photographs from this period, she keeps small objects within reach that reflect her life's journey. A vase of fresh flowers — she has always loved flowers, and arranging them remains a pleasure. A paperweight from Blenheim, sometimes a pair of folded gloves, white kid leather, yellowed with age, preserved as artifacts of a past she has survived. These objects, once tools of performance and constraint, have become in her later years tools for memory, prompts for the story she is finally able to tell in her own words. The narrator reflects that for the first time in her life, the narrative is not being drafted by Alva, by the Duke, by society columnists, by anyone except Consuelo herself. She is claiming authorship of her own story, defining its meaning, interpreting its significance. The memoir is not simply a historical account, but an act of agency, a way of taking control over the narrative that was for so long controlled by others. In the final decade of her life, before her death in Southampton, New York, on 6 December 1964, Consuelo lives between the United States and France, a figure who spans eras. Born in the Gilded Age, married in the height of aristocratic power, living to see the world transformed by 2 world wars, social revolutions, and the near-complete obsolescence of the class system that once defined her existence. Visitors to historic houses, Marble House in Newport, now preserved as a museum, and Blenheim Palace, still occupied by the Marlborough family but increasingly dependent on tourism for its maintenance, encounter Consuelo's image everywhere. Haleo's portrait appears in reproductions, along with John Singer Sargent's drawings and the many society photographs from her years as Duchess. The wedding photographs, particularly those showing her evident distress, are displayed with captions that acknowledge what for decades was only whispered, that this was not a love match but a financial transaction that destroyed a young woman's agency for the sake of social ambition. Exhibition guides speak of dollar princesses, using the term that emerged in the late 19th century to describe American heiresses who married European nobility, bringing estimated total dowries of over $220 million in period dollars to cash-poor estates across Europe. Consuelo's story is presented as perhaps the most famous example of this phenomenon, but visitors also learn about many others. Jenny Jerome, who married Lord Randolph, Churchill and became mother to Winston Churchill, Mary Leader, who became Lady Curzon, Viscountess Curzon of Kettleston, Helena Zimmerman, who married the Duke of Manchester, following the path of Consuelo's godmother. But while these exhibition displays acknowledge the financial architecture of these marriages, Consuelo's own memoir adds a crucial emotional dimension that many of the other dollar princess stories lack. In her own pages, the emphasis is personal rather than merely social historical. The steel rod that shaped her posture, the long hours at her desk learning languages and protocols she never chose to study, the ache of giving up Winthrop Rutherford for a man and a life she never wanted, the slow process of learning to create meaning and dignity within constraints she could not escape. Her later relationship with Alva adds another layer of complexity. In later years, mother and daughter partially reconcile, united by shared commitment to women's suffrage and social reform. Alva, who in her later decades becomes a prominent advocate for women's rights, perhaps comes to see the irony of fighting for women's autonomy while having denied that autonomy to her own daughter. The reconciliation, documented in correspondence and later accounts, is real but incomplete. Some wounds cannot be fully healed, and Consuelo's memoir, published after Alva's death, makes clear that forgiveness does not mean forgetting or excusing what was done. One can imagine the elderly Consuelo, in her Southampton house in the early 1960s, taking from a storage box an old pair of wedding gloves. The white kid leather yellowed now, the tiny pearl buttons dulled, the seams fragile where the leather has dried and weakened over nearly 70 years. She holds them carefully, these artifacts of the most painful day of her life, and perhaps thinks about the girl who wore them. 18 years old, crying behind her veil, being marched up the aisle of St. Thomas's Church toward a future she had begged to be spared. The gloves that once symbolized her compliance and powerlessness have become, in her old age, something different, evidence that a young woman's life could be fitted, stitched, and buttoned to suit others' needs, and also evidence that she found ways, however limited, to reshape that pattern, to claim pieces of autonomy, to eventually tell her own story in her own voice. The narrator observes that the girl sold for a title did not wholly escape the architecture that framed her childhood and young adulthood, but she did, slowly and with great difficulty, learn to describe that architecture, to name its costs, to bear witness to what it took from her. What remains in the archive and in memory is less the glitter of the Gilded Age, the marble palaces and the elaborate balls, the jewels and the titles, than the blueprint of a system that treated women as assets to be managed, shaped, and deployed in service of family ambition. Consuelo's memoir, along with the other documentary evidence of her life, provides that blueprint traced in her own words, showing exactly how privilege constrained as much as it protected, how beauty and wealth coexisted with coercion and pain. The last image is not Marble House or Blenheim Palace, though both have become museums that preserve and interpret Consuelo's story. It is not the Hello portrait, though that elegant image appears in art history texts and continues to define how many people visualize Gilded Age, aristocratic femininity. Instead, the final image is a photograph taken on 6th November 1895, now preserved in various archives and reproduced in histories of the period. the bridal procession moving up the central aisle of St. Thomas's Episcopal Church in New York. The photograph captures the moment from the side, showing the vast crowd of guests in the pews, the elaborate floral decorations creating a bower of white roses and lilies, Governor Levi P. Morton, and other dignitaries identifiable among the assembly. At the center of the composition, the Duke of Marlborough waits at the chancel rail, his posture correct, his expression composed. Moving toward him up the aisle, Consuelo appears in her elaborate wedding gown with its 5-yard train, her face obscured by the tulle veil, but her figure clearly visible. In the foreground of the photograph, her gloved hand rests on her father's arm. Willie K. Vanderbilt performing his role as father of the bride despite the divorce, giving away his daughter as convention requires. Consuelo's fingers are just visible beneath the lace of her sleeve, the white kid leather of her glove catching the light that streams through St. Thomas's windows. The camera has caught her mid-step, frozen between one position and another, between girlhood and Duchess, between being Miss Vanderbilt and becoming Mrs. Charles Spencer Churchill, between private refusal and public obedience, between the life she wanted and the life she has been forced to accept. The photograph is, in this sense, the perfect emblem of her position, caught in the middle, suspended between alternatives neither of which she has chosen, moving forward because that is what the script requires, even though every step takes her further from where she wanted to go. The photograph, like all photographs, has no sound. The rustle of silk as she moves, the murmuring of the crowd commenting on the bride's appearance, her muffled sobs behind the veil, all are gone, translated into the silence of a still image. What remains is the composition, a straight back, the result of years of training with the steel rod and endless deportment lessons, a bowed head, whether in submission or grief, a small pale hand in its perfect glove resting on her father's arm, an arrangement as precise and as costly as any Gilded Age palace. The gloves, visible in this photograph and in others from that day, are perfect, custom-made for the occasion, fitted exactly to her hands, made of the finest, white kid leather with tiny pearl buttons that required patient fastening by a maid that morning at Marble House. They are beautiful objects, expensive and elegant, exactly the kind of detail that fashion magazines would describe and society women would try to emulate. They are also instruments of constraint, symbols of a femininity that is always mediated, never direct, always performing the roles that others have written. Decades later, when Consuelo writes her memoir, when she finally tells her own story in her own words, she returns again and again to details like these gloves. Small, seemingly trivial objects that actually encode entire systems of power and control. The gloves are not just accessories, but artifacts of a world where women's touch on their own lives was always indirect, always channeled through the expectations and requirements of family, class, and patriarchal authority. The photograph endures in archives available to historians and biographers, reproduced in books about the Gilded Age, and about the phenomenon of dollar princesses, studied by scholars trying to understand how the American capitalism and European aristocracy intersected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is a document of social history, evidence of how marriages functioned as economic and political alliances, proof of the spectacular wealth and elaborate social rituals that characterized America's first aristocracy. But it is also something more personal and more painful, a record of a young woman's suffering, a moment when private anguish became public spectacle, an image that captures exactly how privilege can be both protection and prison, how great wealth can coexist with powerlessness, how the most elaborate and expensive arrangements can be built on foundations of coercion and pain. The photograph shows us a bride, but it shows us more truly a woman being sold, her youth and fertility and social position traded for a title and a palace, her own desires and choices deemed irrelevant to the larger purposes of family ambition and social strategy. That she survived this, that she eventually found ways to claim some autonomy and to tell her own story, does not erase what the photograph records. A moment of absolute constraint dressed in silk and lace, presented to the world as triumph but experienced by the woman at its center as defeat.